I never thought my life would change in an instant, and certainly not because of a small piece of cardboard covered in silver scratch-off foil. For as long as I can remember, my days followed the same, predictable rhythm. I worked quietly at the local library, cataloging books, helping children find their first chapter stories, and answering the same old questions from the same old patrons. I lived alone in a modest apartment where the walls were thin and the heater clanked in the winter. My car coughed every time I turned the key, and I had long ago learned to treat an extra cup of coffee or a slice of cake as luxuries to be savored. I was the quiet one in my family, the daughter who blended into the background while my sister Olivia shined in every spotlight and my cousin Jake filled the room with his careless laughter. No one ever asked me how I was really doing. They assumed I would always be fine, because that's what quiet people are expected to be. So when I stopped at the grocery store that Saturday afternoon, my only plan was to grab eggs, bread, and milk. I wasn't looking for excitement, and I certainly wasn't looking for a miracle. But as I stood at the counter, my eyes caught a row of scratch-off lottery tickets hanging from the display. I can't explain why I reached for one. Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was a flicker of rebellion against the predictability of my own life, or maybe fate simply decided it was time for me to see who my family truly was. I handed the cashier $5 and slipped the ticket into my bag without another thought. It wasn't until later that night, when I was sitting alone at my kitchen table with a mug of tea and the low hum of my refrigerator filling the silence, that I remembered the ticket. I pulled it out, grabbed a coin from the drawer, and began scratching absent-mindedly. One number appeared, then another. My hand froze halfway through the third row. I leaned closer, rubbed my eyes, and scratched again, harder this time, as though pressure would make the truth any different. The numbers lined up perfectly. The words beneath them glared back at me, brighter than anything I'd ever seen. $750,000. I dropped the coin, and it clattered loudly against the table, echoing through my small kitchen like a gunshot. My heart raced, my hands trembled, and I sat there in stunned disbelief. This couldn't be real. I had never been that kind of lucky person. I was the one who clipped coupons, who shopped clearance racks, who counted pennies before swiping my debit card. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reread the ticket again and again. I should have felt joy, but instead the first thing I felt was fear. Because I knew exactly what would happen if my family found out. I could already imagine Olivia's smirk, the way she'd tilt her head and say something about how it was only fair that I share. I could picture Jake laughing, acting like he'd always believed I would come through for him eventually. And I could already hear my parents' voices, dripping with false sweetness, telling me how family meant pooling our resources, how no one should be left behind. I wanted to keep it a secret, at least for a little while. I tucked the ticket carefully into an envelope and slid it into the back of my desk drawer, as if paper could hide something that big. I told myself I would think it through, that I'd come up with a plan before anyone knew. But secrets never last long in my family. The very next day, I drove to my parents' house for Sunday lunch. It was a tradition I kept out of obligation more than desire, because not showing up caused more headaches than sitting through the same bland conversations. The house smelled of roast chicken, the same meal my mother had served every Sunday for as long as I could remember. I walked in, bracing myself for the usual routine, but my stomach tightened when I saw Olivia already sitting at the table. She almost never came to Sunday lunch. She was always too busy, always had better plans. Her being there was unusual enough to make my skin prickle. Halfway through the meal, my father set his fork down and leaned forward, his expression casual, but his eyes sharp. "So," he said, tapping the edge of his plate, "I hear you had some luck at the grocery store." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. My heart stumbled in my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound neutral. Olivia smirked, leaning back in her chair like a cat stretching in the sun. "Oh, don't play coy. Jake told me. You hit it big, didn't you? And not just a little scratch-off win. We're talking serious money, right?" I felt the blood drain from my face. Jake must have seen me at the store Friday night. He always had a way of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and, of course, he couldn't keep his mouth shut. My mother turned from the kitchen counter, her smile soft but her eyes sharp in a way that made my stomach churn. Well, darling, this could be a wonderful opportunity for the whole family. We've always believed in sharing, in pooling what we have. You know, making sure no one gets left behind. On the surface, the words might have sounded harmless, even loving. But I knew better. I had lived long enough in this family to understand what sharing meant. It meant I was already the designated supplier. It meant they had plans for money they hadn't earned. I forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. It wasn't much. But their eyes told me they didn't believe me. The air at the table shifted, heavy with something unspoken. Olivia's smirk stretched wider. My father gave me a look that felt less like curiosity and more like appraisal, like he was calculating numbers in his head. Even my mother's smile had a tilt to it, too polite, too expectant. The roast chicken that usually tasted comforting turned to dust in my mouth. I couldn't wait to get out of there. By the time I drove home, my stomach was knotted so tightly I thought I might be sick. I told myself, maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they wouldn't push. Maybe they'd forget about it. But the next morning, my phone buzzed with the first message, and that fragile hope shattered. It was Olivia. I was thinking maybe you could help me with a down payment on a house. Just a temporary loan until mine sells. It would mean so much. Not a single congratulations. Not a single, I'm happy for you. Just a demand wrapped in thin politeness. An hour later, another buzz. Jake this time. Hey, my car's basically dead. Can you spot me $30,000? I'll pay you back by the end of the year. Promise. I almost laughed out loud. A promise from Jake was worth less than the cheap paper he'd scrawl his IOUs on. Then my voicemail blinked with a message from Uncle Robert. His voice was syrupy sweet, filled with false warmth. He hadn't spoken to me in months, but now he wanted to talk about a business opportunity that would be perfect for me to invest in. Not one of them had said they were proud of me. Not one had even asked me how I felt about winning. To them, it wasn't my money. It was theirs. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the glow from my phone painting shadows on the wall. In less than 24 hours, I had learned the truth I had always been too afraid to admit. My family's love was conditional, and the condition had just been tested. For the first time in my life, I realized something. I didn't have to play the quiet, accommodating role anymore. I didn't have to bend under their expectations. They thought they knew me. They thought I would fold. But they had no idea what I was capable of. And before I tell you exactly how I began to turn the tables, if you've ever been drawn to stories where greed strips away masks, where the underestimated rise, and where revenge comes not with shouting but with silence, then make sure you subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. The morning after that uneasy Sunday lunch, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing again and again on the nightstand. At first, I thought maybe it was work or one of the friends I rarely heard from anymore, but when I saw the names lighting up my screen, I felt the familiar twist in my stomach. It was Olivia. It was Jake. It was Uncle Robert. They hadn't wasted a single day. The first message I opened was from Olivia. She didn't bother with a greeting. No good morning. No, how are you? Not even a fake attempt at politeness. Her words were sharp, clipped, and written in the kind of tone she usually reserved for clients she thought she was smarter than. I already spoke to a realtor. The down payment is $120,000. That's practically nothing compared to what you have now. Once my current place sells, I'll pay you back immediately. This is a chance to invest in family stability. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. I almost laughed, but it came out more like a bitter breath. The gall of it. The complete confidence that I would just hand her $120,000 because she had already decided it was the reasonable thing to do. There was no request hidden in those words. It was a declaration, a statement of fact. I didn't even have time to process it before another message buzzed in. This time from Jake. His words were even shorter, written with that careless tone he always used when he thought he was being charming. Spot me $30K for this car flipping deal. Guaranteed profit. Don't overthink it, it's family. When I didn't respond right away, another one followed less than an hour later. I'll swing by later today. Easier if we talk face to face. The knot in my stomach tightened. Jake had always had a way of pushing himself into my space, of pretending boundaries didn't exist, but this time it felt heavier, like he had already convinced himself the money was his. As if the universe wanted to test my limits, my email pinged with a message from Uncle Robert. It was long, full of jargon and buzzwords, leveraging capital, expansion potential, growth markets. I skimmed it once and already knew the truth. His business was failing, and he wanted me to be his lifeline. His email ended with a line that made me clench my fists. With your $200,000 investment, we can make this happen this year. I know you won't let me down. This is about family and legacy. Not one of them said, "Congratulations." Not one said, "I'm proud of you." Not one asked me what I wanted to do with the money. In their eyes, it wasn't my win. It was theirs. By Wednesday, the messages and calls had grown sharper. The fake sweetness started to fade, replaced by a tone that was harder, more insistent. That evening, my phone lit up with my mother's name. I hesitated before answering, already knowing where this conversation would go, but part of me wanted to hear the words out loud, wanted to face the truth I had been dreading. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice calm, almost indulgent, as though she were explaining something to a child. "Your father and I have been talking, and we both think it would be best if you moved the money into a joint family account. That way, we can all help manage it. We'll make sure it's used wisely. You've never had to handle this kind of responsibility before. It's only logical." The words hit me like stones. A joint family account. They weren't even pretending anymore. They weren't asking, they were preparing to take. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep my voice steady. "A joint account," I repeated, as if I hadn't heard her correctly. "Yes," she replied gently, almost as though she were soothing a toddler. "It's only logical. You can trust us. We're family." Her words wrapped around me like a chain. Trust us. We're family. I wanted to scream, to shout that family doesn't mean ownership, that trust isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. But I didn't. Instead, I forced my lips into a smile that she couldn't see, and I said, "I'll think about it." She chuckled softly, the way she always did when she believed she had already won. "That's my good girl. Don't take too long, darling. Opportunities slip away if you hesitate." When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the shadows stretching across my apartment. My mother's words echoed in my ears, not because of their content, but because of what they revealed. They didn't see me as someone who had achieved something remarkable. They saw me as a child who had stumbled into more than she could handle, a child who needed guidance, a child who should hand over control before she ruined everything. The next day, Jake made good on his promise. He showed up at my apartment without warning, pounding on the door until I opened it. He walked in without hesitation, flopping onto my couch as though he owned it. "Cousin," he said loudly, his grin wide and his arms spread, "we need to finalize this deal. I found the perfect lot. The seller won't wait forever. If you wire me the money before Friday, we'll be rolling in profit before the month is out." I crossed my arms, my jaw tightening. "Jake, I never agreed to anything." His grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. "Don't be difficult. This is family. You don't want to come off as selfish, do you?" That word, selfish, sliced through me like ice. Selfish, for wanting to keep what I had earned? Selfish, for refusing to let them strip me bare? I bit down on the rage rising in my chest and forced my face into a mask of calm. "I'll think about it," I said evenly. Jake studied me for a moment, then leaned back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't believe me. Not really. He thought he was wearing me down. He thought persistence would break me. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a group text from Olivia. It included Jake, Uncle Robert, and my parents. "We need to sit down as a family and make decisions together. This money affects all of us. Let's meet this weekend." I stared at the words until my vision blurred. This money affects all of us. There it was, written plain. They had erased me from the equation entirely. In their minds, the lottery hadn't been my miracle. It had been theirs. They had already divided it, already spent it, already decided how my future would unfold without me. That night, lying in the dark, I felt the weight of two choices pressing down on me. I could fight them directly, shouting and arguing, throwing their hypocrisy in their faces. But I knew how that would end. They would turn it on me. They would call me ungrateful, cold, unloving. They would corner me with guilt until I bent under the pressure. Or I could do something else. Something smarter. I could let them believe I was bending, let them think I was uncertain, let them taste victory on the tips of their tongues, and then I could pull it all away in one swift, silent move. The next morning I began my plan. I texted Olivia back. Of course, let's talk about the house loan. Coffee this week. I replied to Jake. Tell me more about the car lot. I want the details. I even answered Uncle Robert's bloated email. I'm open to the idea. Could you draft some formal paperwork? And when my mother called again to press the joint account, I softened my voice, let a tremor of doubt creep in, and said, You might be right. Maybe I do need some guidance. I'll think on it a little longer. Every word I spoke was bait. Every smile, every pause, every vague promise was a thread in the web I was weaving. They believed I was folding. They believed the quiet one was finally surrendering. But what they didn't know, what they would never see coming, was that I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to give them a single cent. I wasn't going to fight them in their arena of guilt and manipulation. I was going to lure them into mine. And when the time came, I would show them just how dangerous the quiet one could be. Before I tell you exactly how I set the trap, if you're still here, if you feel the pressure of their greed pressing against me the way I did, then make sure you subscribe, because the way I turned the tables is something my family never saw coming. By the time Sunday arrived, I felt like I was living inside two different worlds, the one my family thought they controlled, and the one I had carefully, quietly built for myself. On the surface, I was the same accommodating Sarah they had always underestimated, the sister who would cave eventually, the cousin who would do the right thing, the daughter who could be guilt into obedience. I nodded at their messages, answered their calls, agreed to their suggestions with vague phrases like, I'll think about it, all while they congratulated themselves in private for slowly wearing me down. But beneath that mask, I was something entirely different. I had already moved every cent into a trust with legal walls, so strong not even Olivia's lawyer friends or Uncle Robert's shady business partners could scratch at it. The money was untouchable, secured, beyond their grasp. And the only thing left to do was let them walk into the trap I had been weaving all week. That Sunday morning, I woke earlier than usual, my stomach tight, but my resolve sharper than it had ever been. I wanted everything about the day to feel ordinary, so that the contrast between their expectations and what I was about to give them would slice all the deeper. I roasted a chicken, seasoned it with thyme and lemon, and filled the apartment with a warmth that smelled like comfort. I reheated vegetables I had prepared earlier in the week, set out a loaf of bread I had baked on Friday, and poured water into a plain glass carafe. I laid out my simple white dishes, added a modest vase of flowers at the center of the table, and pulled out an inexpensive bottle of wine. Nothing about the setting shouted celebration, and that was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't here to celebrate. I was here to reveal. Olivia arrived first, right on time, dressed in a cream-colored dress that looked better suited to a luncheon at some high-rise hotel. She carried a glossy chocolate tart that she placed at the center of the table with a kind of triumphant smile that made my skin crawl. Her eyes flickered around the apartment quickly, searching for signs of paperwork, envelopes, or even a checkbook. "This looks lovely," she said sweetly, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. Jake came next, grinning broadly, wearing a blazer over his usual jeans as though trying to convince me he was suddenly professional. He hugged me with a heavy clap on my back, his cologne too strong, his eyes darting toward the sideboard as though expecting to see piles of cash laid out in neat stacks. "This is going to be good, cousin," he said with a laugh that rang hollow. Uncle Robert followed, lugging a briefcase in one hand and a bottle of cheap wine in the other, holding it up like it was worth something. "For you," he said, pressing it into my hands. I thanked him politely, though I knew the real gift he planned to deliver was inside that briefcase. Contracts, proposals, whatever half-baked paperwork he thought could trick me into surrendering $200,000 for his doomed business. My parents arrived last, their faces calm, their steps measured, as though they were walking into a meeting where the outcome had already been decided. My mother kissed my cheek, my father patted my shoulder, and they both smiled with that same false warmth I had grown up recognizing. We sat, we ate, and for a while the conversation drifted through the safe, shallow waters of family small talk. We spoke about the weather, about Olivia's job, about a neighbor's new dog. But beneath the surface, the anticipation was heavy enough to taste. Every time I lifted my fork, every time I opened my mouth to speak, I could feel them leaning in slightly, waiting for me to announce what they believed was already theirs. When the plates were cleared and the coffee poured, I let the silence stretch. I wanted them restless. I wanted them leaning so far forward that when I finally spoke, the words would send them crashing backward. At last, I set my cup down and folded my hands on the table. I've been giving a lot of thought to everything you've all said. I began slowly. My voice was calm, even warm, but I could see Olivia straighten immediately, her eyes shining. Jake leaned forward, his grin widening. Uncle Robert's hand shifted toward his briefcase, and my parents both nodded as though I had just confirmed their victory. I thought about the house, the car deal, the business investment, even the idea of a joint account. I continued. I listened to every argument and every piece of advice, and I realized you were right about one thing. Olivia pounced, her words quick, eager. Exactly, so if we just sign. I raised a hand, and she fell silent, her eyes narrowing in irritation. You were right, I said softly, that this money is an opportunity, but not in the way you think. Olivia's smirk faltered, but she tried to recover. Of course it is. The sooner we put it to good use. I've already put it to good use, I interrupted. I moved all $750,000 into a trust. The room froze. Jake's grin collapsed. A trust? What does that even mean? It means, I said, my tone sharpening just slightly, that the money is no longer mine to hand out casually. It can only be accessed by the people I've named in the trust documents, people who have stood by me without expecting anything in return, people who have been kind to me when I had nothing to offer back. A heavy silence fell over the room. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Olivia's voice cut through, sharp as glass. And who exactly made that list? I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the silence before I answered. Mrs. Lawson, my neighbor, who fixed my car in the dead of winter without ever asking for payment. Anna, my closest friend from the library, who sat with me all night when I was sick and alone. And Mr. Davis, the retired teacher who taught me budgeting years ago when I was barely scraping by. Jake slammed his palm against the table. So, no family? Not a single one of us. No family, I said, meeting his glare without blinking. My mother's face flushed, her voice rising. Sarah, that's absurd. We are your blood. I don't know anyone for being related to me, I said firmly, my voice cutting through hers. And I certainly don't know people who saw me as a bank account the second they heard I won. My father tried a gentler approach, his voice coaxing, reasonable. We only wanted to help you make the right choices. We have more experience with money than you do. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes never leaving his. If that were true, you wouldn't have started by dividing it up for yourselves before I even had a chance to speak. Uncle Robert cleared his throat, his tone shifting to a dark warning. You'll regret this, Sarah. People will remember how selfish you've been, how ungrateful. And when you need help one day. I smiled then, small but genuine. If protecting myself from being drained by people who feel entitled to my life makes me selfish, I can live with that. The silence that followed was absolute. Olivia's eyes burned. Jake muttered curses under his breath. Uncle Robert snapped his briefcase shut with a loud click, and my parents looked at me with expressions caught between outrage and disbelief. One by one, they stood and left, their goodbyes clipped, their footsteps heavy. When the door finally closed behind the last of them, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The apartment was silent again, and for the first time in weeks, that silence felt like freedom. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the table, the trust documents resting neatly on my desk in the corner. There was no rush of victory, no wild triumph. Just a calm, steady relief. The money was safe. I was safe. And while it hurt to face the truth that my family's love had always been conditional, there was a strange kind of freedom in knowing exactly where I stood. I lifted my glass in a quiet toast to the empty room. To keeping what matters, I whispered, before taking a slow sip and letting the peace of the night finally settle around me. And if you've stayed with me through the story, if you've felt the sting of betrayal and the satisfaction of standing firm, then make sure you subscribe, because there will always be another story, another reckoning, another moment where the underestimated rise, and you'll want to be here when it happens.